Welcome back to the show, everybody. Today is an exciting day because Baldur's Gate 3 is out. This is absolutely a generational game. It is the culmination of an interesting and fairly atypical set of circumstances that has led to a company being able to absolutely punch above their weight and deploy a tremendous amount of resources to a single title. So, Baldur's Gate 3, if you're not aware, it's a CRPG in the more traditional sense. It's a sequel, of course, to the Baldur's Gate games from BioWare back in the old days, set in D&D's Forgotten Realms setting. In terms of gameplay, it is the kind of RPG, though, that I think people have been hoping for years, in that it is extremely reactive to your choices. It is very systems-driven and utterly focused on character-led action. I mean, even think about like the camera work that you're seeing and even the trailers, the previews. It's an utterly shocking amount of production for a game of this format. It's crazy. Now, this is all working in a modified D&D 5th edition rule set that, of course, is built from the ground up for this game. And in terms of length and stuff, we're looking at a 75 to 100 hour game length with 17,000 permutations of ending and 170 hours of alternative cutscenes. Of course, that's 17,000 permutations. As you know, if you have lots of different variables, it can be different. You're then, to work out the total number of different variations, you're multiplying those together, so your endings do, your quantity of endings, technically speaking, does get rather silly as you keep on multiplying those. Also, a pretty shocking feature, this is a game that you can play entirely in co-op with 3 friends, including 2-player split screen on one console or PC, which is cracked. Now, the thing is, this is coming from Larian. Larian have been making games in the Divinity setting. Now, the one that I remember the most was Divinity Dragon Commander, but from Dragon Commander, of course, they moved on just a year later to Original Sin. It then got its enhanced edition. Then there was Original Sin. They are really damn good RPGs. And the overall point here is that, with Divinity, they were working in that setting for a long-ass time. With Original Sin and Original Sin 2, they've been working in a similar format of game to Baldur's Gate 3, meaning that versus almost any other studio, you are looking at so much finely honed and finely acquired talent over many years, just laser targeted to make a game like this. Now, this is PC August 3rd, PS5 September 6th, no Xbox yet, and the team have actually said why. It's because they cannot get split-screen co-op working acceptably in the Series S, and because that's the case, they can't publish on either Xbox. You are allowed to have some different features between the two of them, like obviously ray tracing, but if it's a back-of-the-box gameplay feature, there needs to be parity between S and X. Currently, they don't feel their S version is up to snuff, so the whole thing does have to be delayed. Ultimately, though, that they're going to do that delay in order to deliver a quality product that meets their standards, that is absolutely what you want to hear. And if you want some dates there, Per Sven, their CEO, he said in June that it might actually not launch this year. So probably some sort of engineering hurdle to overcome. Now, of course, the thing is, this is a game that came out into early access. And yes, people have been playing the game since October of 2020. And this makes me think of Dave the Diver, funnily enough. That's a game that had a year of early access, finally honed itself, and because of that, had an absolutely explosive launch. Here, we are seeing that on the largest of scales. So, you take a look at the early access release. The red bar is decently sized. The blue bar for positive reviews is far larger, though. What this means is that fans feel a strong sense of ownership over, over the game. To all my early access homies, it's been real. It's actually helped the game build a community so that whenever launch day happens, there's a dedicated community there, right? There's, that backing of elite troops that makes the whole army feel rallied or whatever. I don't know, that was a weird analogy. But yes, early access has been a massive boon for this game. And they confirmed that 2.5 million copies of the game had been shifted before launch. Now, this is the bit where it comes to disclosure time. I purchased this game with my own money yesterday and haven't played any early access. That said, a mutual friend of much of our team ended up, I think it was last year perhaps, getting a job at Larian. So I believe, yes, the writer and editor of this video, they both, Connell and Connor, they both do have a copy of the game that was provided to them for free, not in an official sense, but I think in the way that like employees just get a few codes that they're able to hand out to like friends and family. That only happened a few days ago though, so it's not like, they've been playing a free copy of the game for years. But you should know that because that is indeed what happened. One thing that propelled this was the bear. People generally liked Baldur's Gate 3. People really liked the television show The Bear, but this is not about that, because this is about shagging a bear. Shagging a bear is one of the things that you can do, because hey, if you are dealing with druids that can shapeshift, I suppose, why be a coward? Just do that. There you go. Yes, you can shag the bear druid. And this is perhaps responsible for at least several of this next very impressive number, because, yeah, the all-time player peak is 471,000, basically 472 if we're rounding. That is extremely impressive for what is mostly a single-player game. Obviously, I know co-op's there, but it's not like this is a battle royale. That is an extremely impressive number. I mean, other games that come to mind are like Hogwarts Legacies. It was a bit higher than this, I believe in the very low 500s. Suffice to say though, this is a humongous number. This is the sort that any AAA game would absolutely love. Now that said, there was one thing that was not particularly ideal, which is the review situation, because look, every review is positive. That's a good thing. There are a range of bugs that I think with a game of this level of systemic involvement, depth, fidelity, yeah, there's going to be bugs. But what was a bit unfortunate though is the review build of the game was delayed for critics and streamers, initially not until a week before launch, but then it was actually delayed by another 2 days, which meant that it happened 3.5 days before launch. So if you've wondered why the big outlets that you maybe follow for reviews, or some of the people you follow for reviews, if you wonder why they didn't have like a full feature, I finished the game, it's because, yeah, the demo or the review build was only 3.5 days before launch, which in terms of number of hours, like even if you just played the game for 3.5 hours straight, or days straight, and did not sleep, that would not be enough time to finish the game. So obviously for a finished review, that's impossible. Yeah, it's not a small game. And if you want the reasons for this, it's pretty simple. Usually it is last-minute bugs that would absolutely scupper reviews. There are other times, though, where a developer or publisher is trying to hide problems in the game by making sure that reviews can't go out except in a rush to meet embargo, and that will end up playing to their favor. We all know what it's like whenever a game has issues, and maybe the review embargo is also launch day. And there's also been a very small review period. That kind of thing can just kind of suck. Except though, we should probably think about Starfield, because that had an impact on this game, right? So Baldur's Gate 3 was supposed to launch September 6th. Starfield took that date, right? And of course, because it's Starfield, the preceding weeks of, reviewer work and marketing, that all would have been going into Starfield, because as big as Baldur's Gate is, it's not Starfield. Of course, if you move it forward by a few weeks, then you get Armored Core 6, right? It can't go further into that storm of like autumn, early winter games. So they actually moved things forward, right? They moved their launch forward. It's probably ended up being good enough for players. Evidently, though, for the review build, it did cause them some issues. But even with those unfortunate things, like assuming you can tolerate D&D mechanics, it does seem that this is pretty much exactly the best that you could hope for. This is pretty sweet. And speaking of good things, I should say our game, The Pale Beyond, was featured in a daily deal by Valve a few days ago. And that means that currently it's 25% off. It's 25% off until the 6th of August. So if you want to pick up our narrative, survival, role-playing game inspired by the heroic age of Antarctic Expedition, you can do that on Steam. The link will be down below, as well as a link to store.bellular.games, which includes the new collector's edition goodies like this art book that our team put together. So store.bellular.games, Steam link down below. And with that said, let's talk about how things have actually been going. So people are assuming that Larian will eventually be working toward a definitive edition of this game. That is something that they've done for both of their Divinity games. And that likely means a whole big swath of new classes, races, quest lines, and more stuff probably being built out over time to fill in gaps in the D&D source books, right? Which is pretty cool. I mean, you launch your base game, and then you just get to do your definitive edition victory lap. Just that this time around, they got to have a very successful early access to make the actual game that came out extremely successful. The idea that we could then have a definitive edition of that is kind of insane, and certainly given this success in terms of sales, I think they'll be able to afford it. And while this is one single humongous project, there are interesting things to say about Larian in general, right? Because they've learned a lot from Baldur's Gate 3. Perhaps they will be applying things to Divinity, which is their own fantasy setting. And this is what the CEO Sven said to Bloomberg. He doesn't know yet what Larian will do next. However, he hinted he hopes to work on multiple games and has expressed the desire to make something smaller next time. He certainly doesn't want to spend another 6 years developing a single game, he said, which I think is fair, and it does highlight that Baldur's Gate 3 is something that absolutely is very special. You very rarely see a game like this, and there are good reasons why. Now, this did lead to an interesting discussion that absolutely exploded online, and tonally I think it was a bit strange. I feel like some of it was a little bit reactionary, and it was kind of lumping things in with that thing where a few Horizon devs made an absolute tit out of themselves by, just basically talking smack about Elden Ring. Led to some very funny memes of like, this is what Elden Ring would look like if the Horizon developers made its UI, and all these big cluttered messes are, Ubisoft bullshit. But in this case, from my read of it, it was a lot of AAA devs just being like, yeah, don't expect this as your average sort of AAA game, because this is the result of a interesting set of circumstances. Because often the games we get are the result of their production realities, because it's the production that makes the game. And that's why there are things to go into here. So an indie game developer, Zalaver Nelson, was prompted by some of the reaction that he was seeing to this game, right? That maybe said to him that some people were unaware of some of the development specifics of this game. People kind of saying that, this is the new standard for all RPGs, from Starfield to Sea of Stars, everything. It has to meet up with this kind of incredible mega game. And what he basically was doing was pulling the curtain back a bit to talk about how Baldur's Gate 3 is the perfect storm of conditions to allow for something like this to exist. As he said at the end, and it's unfortunate the thread went viral in the way that it did, in an era of mega games, Baldur's Gate 3 is one of the largest attempted, built by a specialized group of people using mature technology specifically built to make this specific game, reinforced by invaluable mass player feedback and market validation ahead of its launch. This is not the new baseline for RPGs, this is an anomaly. Trying to do the same thing in the same way, especially without the same advantages, could kill an entire group of studios. That is absolutely true, because the point is, they made Divinity. They made Divinity 2. They did the definitive editions of those games. They were able to get this into early access, then spend 3 years. So, can other studios do this sort of thing? Yes, they absolutely can. However, rather than just saying hubristically, we're going to make a game like Baldur's Gate 3, here is $100 million. Away you go. Or $200 million. Can't do it like that. Because money doesn't make the game. Money pays for the team, and the team makes the game. And if you're allocating all that money to a team who's not set up to make this kind of game in this type of time frame, you're not going to make this game successfully. And as he suggests, that could kill a studio. And of course, that is exactly the sort of AAA hubris that we see all the time, where they're like, oh, that format of game, cool, we want one, here's a bunch of money, do it. And then Anthem happens. And we all think, what? Hang on, did you just try to, because if you look at Anthem is almost like the anti-this, and of course, I think it's a fun thing to bring up, because Anthem, of course, is a BioWare game. Baldur's Gate 1 and 2 are BioWare games. Now, Anthem, was the team experienced in making that kind of game? No. Did the team have core technologies that were, tailor-made to make that type of game? No. Those things led to Anthem probably taking as long, if not longer, than Baldur's Gate 3 to make, and being Anthem. Because it turns out money and team size is important, but technology, experience, those things are what actually makes the game. You need the money to pay for that, but if you don't have that, you won't make the game. So that was basically the core thing that kicked this off. Now, did every game developer who then reacted to that, react perfectly? No. I think in many cases it's people just being kind of worried that, hey, I'm working at, insert company here. it's going to be a shame if we're held to this standard, because this is the sort of game that, like, this is probably the only group of people in the world who could make this with that time and budget, because it is a once in a sort of generation game. And that's one of the challenging things, I suppose. I mean, even, developers at Obsidian kind of, made some comments there, and it's like, goddamn, Obsidian. Like, if anyone, they'd be a bit closer to being able to make games like this, given, Pillars of Eternity and everything. But I think a lot of the drama that followed this is really ignoring the point of the original thread. So it's really not about whether developers are worried that Baldur's Gate 3 is better than their games. It's more that they're worried that if they make lesser games that are still great, that they'll be called out for that. And this is the challenging thing where we say, yeah, well, it's the free market, and the free market has created these people called Larian, and they've just beaten you up and taken your lunch. Yeah, true, they have. But also, it's a little bit like, what's he called? Is it I've forgotten his name. The chess boy. Very good chess boy. Oh my god, I can't believe I've forgotten his name. But the whole thing is like, he's just a complete anomaly, right, in his ability to play chess. Or like, like a Michael Phelps, where it's like, yeah, the structure of your body is weird and different, and that helps you become an excellent swimmer. It's like, Larian is so fine-tuned to make this type of game that to expect another studio to successfully make this type of game is perhaps not, not a wise thing. But of course, Larian, they can make this game, make it so good, and charge what they're able to charge here, because the game is so good that it will attract a humongous audience and a lot of revenue, as we can quite evidently see it is. So basically, Baldur's Gate 3 is, it's a million things going right when every single party involved is at the best they can possibly be. And to actually go through some of these factors, Larian is an independent company. That means they don't have to deal with publisher demands other than Wizards of the Coast licensing requirements. Dungeons & Dragons as an IP is at the apex of its mainstream popularity, of course, also coming off the back of a movie that people were actually quite surprised, at its quality, or at least how much fun it was to watch. And also, there are no force requirements to rush a release or to change features. Again, take a look at another BioWare game, Mass Effect 3. EA basically said, oh, Mass Effect 2, good? Right, you've got 18 months to make the next one, good luck! And in a world where we talk about Jedi Survivor being, a rapid development cycle at 3.5 to 4 years, you look at what they accomplished for Mass Effect 3, and it is genuinely insane that Mass Effect 3 is as good as it is, given how EA seemingly did most of the things they could do to make it a bad game by ruining the conditions of its development. The other point here is that bar a few educational titles, Larian have only made CRPGs. They've made CRPGs for 20 years. Their senior staff, the people that they have who hire the people that make this game, have been making CRPGs for years and years and years and years, right? They've also hired up people to, of course, supplement those existing staff. There's no dilution of staff time or resources. There's nobody splitting time between, say, this and building a first-person shooter, which happens at some other studios. So this is 6 years of development that is actually built upon years of, or decades, 2 decades perhaps, of work on tools, on engine, on systems, right? And again, it's not just like the material benefits there, it is the internal knowledge of how to make this sort of game. Again, there's times I talk about game feel, the way you see somebody who's really good at playing Quake, and they just know whenever to pre-fire a rocket. Around a corner, and they'll just blind kill somebody because they know how all the movements are, not because they could sit down and write them all out on a piece of paper, but because they have game sense and they can feel it. Well, there is a thing that's like a game developer sense, so like, as an example, Pale Beyond, we made this. Now we're making another game. I'll talk about that in the future. Point though is, our team's game sense has increased massively. And now we're finding like, oh my god, it took us months to answer these questions before. Now we're answering them instantly because we have more game sense. And we're, still making a form of role-playing game, right? So it's just one of those things. It's one of those intangibles. It's why whenever we see high levels of employee attrition at big AAA studios, we start to get worried. If you want to know why big AAA studios seemingly have all the money and the resources, but don't end up finding the fun, it's things like this, right? So Larian is running at a, almost like anti-AAA in terms of a lot of the inherent downsides of those teams, unfortunately, are saddled with, but with the resources undoubtedly of a AAA team. That's what leads to a very special game. This has been in development since 2017. They had 3 successful years of early access, constant feedback, constant bug testing, and also constant funding as well. So they are launching in an absurd position of strength, right? And while this is not something that other studios will be easily able to do, there are lessons to be learned from this. So while I think that holding other games to the standard of Baldur's Gate 3 is not, we can talk about whether it's good or bad, wise or not. We could just go to the more objective thing, which I would say is it's not a realistic thing to judge them by. But what we can do is hope the development teams learn from Baldur's Gate 3, that they see all of the things that went right, that led to this game being as good as it is, and that they work that into how they plan and build games, because that will mean that they're actually getting the true value out of the staff that they've hired, instead of misusing and wasting those staff. I don't know why, but let's just take a minute to laugh at Skull and Bones. And now that we've done that, let's get back to the news. So, one group who would kind of know a lot about this is Obsidian. Obsidian, of course, you might know them from Fallout New Vegas, but they've been making CRPGs for ages, and they were damn good at making CRPGs. Pillars of Eternity stands out as a genre classic. Then, Pillars of Eternity 2 was a publicly acknowledged failure that did not sell as much as the original, because the Kickstarter provided fans of that game with the game, and there just wasn't enough to maintain momentum post-launch. As for a multitude of reasons, it just didn't sell and release, despite it having a very, positive reception, as positive as the first one. So it's one of those things. Sometimes audiences can be fickle, supporting you right up until they don't. That can then end up tanking the company. And, of course, obviously, what do Obsidian end up doing? They end up being slurped up by Phil Spencer, and they're a Microsoft studio now. That being said, they still do get to have benefits of having done Pillars of Eternity and its sequel, because Avowed is in fact set in the Pillars of Eternity settings. So there's absolutely a lot of stuff that will positively apply to Avowed. Now, of course, Obsidian were lucky. They have an amazing history. They have amazing, recognition. They were able to get some other publisher funding on The Outer Worlds. But the thing is, for a smaller team, even a AA or AAA, like that can lead to death and hundreds of layoffs. And let me tell you, I can't exactly say who, but there's a few people I talk to, and it's like, oh shit, you're like real. Why are you talking to me? I'm just some dickhead in Northern Ireland. You're like, in a video games place, and your numbers have more zeros than my numbers. Wow. But sometimes I hear from those guys, and one of the things that you kind of begin to understand. A lot of these newer big venture capital backed games, for the companies, it is do or die, right? Absolutely do or die. If the game doesn't hit whatever, dead. No way you'll afford that run rate. No way at all. I remember one time somebody I know is in the games industry in California said, and it was for a senior position, it was animation, and it was $300,000 a year. That was the salary. That's crazy. And this is perhaps where I could talk a little bit about Larian themselves. So they actually have 6 locations, and one of the reasons, of course, that plenty of us in my team, we have a mate who's in Larian, is because they did open up in Dublin. So locationally, right, they've got Barcelona, Dublin, Ghent, Guildford, Kuala Lumpur, and Quebec, right? Notably, some of those places are expensive. They ain't California expensive, and that probably means that their dollary dues go a little bit further. It's a chunky team, 450 people. And I think for all of the AAA bashing, which, hey, you guys know I have a lot of criticisms of AAA, it's worth noting what the CEO of Larian himself actually said about this whole thing that went on, about the discourse. He said that audiences and critics shouldn't be claiming that this sets a new standard for everything. Games like ours are very specific. It's what we wanted to make, and it's what we specialize in, so it's logical we have a certain pedigree in creating it, because we've been building these games for 20 years already. I don't think there's such a thing as a game that says, oh, this is the standard and everyone has to hold themselves to it, because tomorrow someone else will come up with something new and cool. Standards change so rapidly that there are no standards. So definitely a relatively safe answer. Of course, one of those things, you can just be like, yeah, of course our game's fucking sick. We've been making these for 20 years. Don't call us the standard, because you know, implicitly, we all know. Yeah, I just think it's an interesting topic. What I am very for, though, is like a lot of these just companies being able to, you know, punch a little bit harder. Recently, I've been playing a game called Remnant 2. We called it out in our June Games Roundup video. Remnant 2 is fantastic, you know, and it's completely built off the strengths of Remnant 1. And it's just one of those things of like, oh yeah, you guys have like, you're doing a thing. You're doing a sequel to the thing. That makes a lot of sense. It's really fun. You've clearly like learned from thing 1 to thing 2. You know, this is what allows studios to get stronger and stronger and stronger. I think the problem is whenever some of these AAAs get, you know, gobbled up by one of the big, you know, publishers like your Ubisofts, your Electronic Artses, your Activision Blizzards, and then they are just all put on to, you know, make this game. You didn't come up with it. We bought you so you could make more Call of Duty. And it's like, Toys for Bob. Are they really going to be specialized at making Call of Duty? Probably not. Bit weird, right? So that's kind of the situation. What should we learn from this? Number 1, this is a game that I think is worth checking out. Number 2, we should think about how we build our teams. And we should think about like what kind of inherent skill sets we want in our teams. And we should probably think about how we can compound on prior successes instead of just randomly flipping between different sorts of projects, you know, at the whims of some publisher that owns us. Right? I think it's one of those things whenever the big suit people get to, I mean, even take Arcane. Got a bunch of people who make immersive sims. You try to get them to make a multiplayer looty shoot thing. Why did you do that? That was silly. So in a way, I would say, actually, if you want this is not to hold games to the standard Baldur's Gate 3, but if you want the anti-Baldur's Gate 3, as in, if this is the perfect use of a team, let's talk about the perfect misuse of a team, that's got to be Redfall. Because that's not a team experience in making that kind of game. Why did you get them to do that? So the games industry gives us lots of lessons about what we should or should not do, and indeed they are lessons that I think we can take out of this context and apply to our own lives. So thinking about this makes us all the wiser. If you would like to support my team, then you can pick up The Pale Beyond, which is 25% off until August 6th. Thanks for the feature, Valve and Gabe. All very cool. And if you want to buy some of our collector's edition goodies, you can do that at store.bellular.games. All right, have a brilliant day. And yeah, I suppose go play Baldur's Gate 3. I mean, you best get started now. It's bloody long. All right, see you next time.